Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode with Cade Metz. Cade's been a technology reporter for over 30 years and he's currently at the New York Times. He released a fantastic book last year on the history and the story of AI and how it came to be. I hope you enjoy our chat. If you do, please hit subscribe. It really helps the channel if you could do that. And thank you for watching. So Cade, you spent the first few years of your career actually as a playwright before eventually switching over to tech journalism. What inspired that switch?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a switch. I've always had this dual interest, a dual background. I was an English major in college. My senior thesis was a novella, but my father was an engineer. And during college, I had an internship at IBM. He was a career IBMer, my father, a programmer, and through him, I had a scholarship, and part of the scholarship was a summer internship as a programmer. And in college, I took programming courses as well, and math and science courses. So I always had this dual interest. And I had a particular interest in writing about engineers. I felt like engineers and researchers were underrepresented, even in tech journalism. Tech stories in the mainstream press are typically about the entrepreneurs, right? The people building the companies, as opposed to people really building the technology. And I always felt like that was unexplored territory or underrepresented territory. So I always had an interest in writing about not just the technology, but the people really building the technology.
First thing that comes to mind then is like Steve Wozniak in the whole kind of Apple story. You must have been thinking about him a bit then, as opposed to the guy who was really talked about, which was Steve Jobs.
Yeah, that's a good example. I always felt like engineers were as interesting as anybody else, right? The sort of the trope, the assumption is that engineers are somehow boring and uninteresting, but I think the opposite is true. My father, like I said, was an engineer and a career IBMer, and he had these amazing stories about the people that he worked with. He worked on, among other things, the UPC project at IBM, so the Universal Product Code, the barcode that is now on all our groceries, right? This is how we buy our groceries. He worked on that original project. He helped test the system, and he had these incredible stories, not only about the people who built the system and first dreamed it up. A guy named Joe Woodland, first envisioned this technology when he was on the beach back in the 50s. But also about how the technology affected people as it was pushed out into the world. In the early 70s, as they began testing and deploying the system, there were literally protests against IBM and this system. People who saw it as the sign of the beast from Revelations come to life. Why would you push this out into the world? And those types of stories, they were entertaining, they were amusing, but they also, shone a light on the way technology can affect people and hit certain parts of their psyche in ways you might not expect. And I've always been interested in exploring those types of things.
Speaking of IBM, one thing I wanted to ask you was about something I saw online, which said that you reported on, you were reporting during the kind of 1997 match between IBM's Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov. Can you tell me a little bit about that time and the level of excitement and what it felt like to be in reporting on that?
Right. I was in New York at the time, and that event was put together in the city. It was a remarkable event, in part because of the attention that was on it, in part because of the way it played out and how surprised Kasparov was um, by the machine that he was playing. Right. Um, that's what was most interesting is that it kind of caught him, let alone everyone else, by surprise. And it was interesting years later when I covered the Go match between AlphaGo, the system built by DeepMind, the AI lab in London that had been purchased by Google, and Lee Sedol, who's one of the best Go players of the last decade. That that played out in a similar way, but just on an even larger scale. Um, it helped that I was able to contrast and compare that with what had happened years earlier in New York with Deep Blue and Gary Kasparov.
I know the level of access you had at the AlphaGo match where you at the venue. Like, were you at the venue during the IBM match against Kasparov, or were you kind of reporting on the news you heard? Like, where were you exactly?
I was at the venue as well. It was in a hotel on the west side of Manhattan, and it was I remember you had sort of stadium seating for a large um, a large TV or movie screen that would show the match, and you had commentators, chess experts, who provided commentary in real time as if it was a sporting event. But no, I was there for every match back then, um, and again, it was nice to compare and contrast that with what happened years later in Seoul with AlphaGo and Lee Sedol.
Yeah, so we'll come on to AlphaGo in a minute. I've got a few questions about that, but you're at the New York Times at the moment. After staying with PC Magazine for a number of years, what were some kind of highlights during the kind of 15 or so years you were there? Did any specific inventions come out, or were there any kind of moments that made that you kind of stand out as being the most exciting during your career reporting?
Well, I mean, I think that the Kasparov match was certainly one of those moments. Um, you know, uh, beyond that, nothing really compared to what would happen, in later years, with the type of technology we're going to talk about here, meaning AI technology. For nothing happened for years and years. During during that period, kind of sort of the late '90s, early 2000s, it was what people often called an AI winter. Right, there wasn't the interest or the funding going into the field that you would see in later years. The field really changed in in the late 2000s, early 2010s. Right, there was an inflection point where the field really took off in some unexpected ways, and that's what has really been interesting.
I'm not sure where you were exactly at the time, but I know after PC Magazine, you worked at the Register for a few years. I'm just thinking of one event, like the iPhone launch in 2007. Was that an interesting moment? Where were you working then? Just to kind of think about another event outside of the AI space.
Sure. I was at PC Magazine at the time. I was at the event where Steve Jobs unveiled it. Um, these are carefully designed and orchestrated press events. It's almost like a concert, right? It's at this place called a rock concert. This place called the Marconi Center in San Francisco, um, and they're carefully chosen songs playing as everyone is sort of gathering and waiting for Steve Jobs to come on stage, and and his speech. Um, while unforgettable, right? You in hindsight, you realize just how carefully, he's trying to pull the strings, right? He comes out and he says, I'm gonna unveil three devices today, right? One's a phone, one's a camera, and one's an internet connection device, right? And then the big reveal is it's all one device, right? It's all, and all the Apple faithful are there. Um, those events are interesting as sort of um, as you know as a window into the way Steve Jobs would operate and kind of pull the strings on the general public and the Apple faithful. But it's far less interesting to me than an event like the Go match in Korea, um, because something is playing out there in real time, where no one quite knows what's going to happen, and you see the technology affect people in unexpected ways. That's far more interesting to me.
So after you're at the Register, you moved to Wired magazine. Yeah, and good to talk about AlphaGo now, because I think you were at Wired when the AlphaGo challenge match happened. And this is how I first kind of heard of you. I saw you on the documentary, this brilliant documentary I'd recommend everyone watches, produced by DeepMind on the AlphaGo match. So yeah, just to say a little bit more about it, I know you said a bit already, but can you just talk a bit more about what that experience was like, what your week or so there was like, and how it felt, the excitement?
What I often tell people is that even though I was just an observer to this match, right? I was not a participant. I was an observer. It was one of the most amazing weeks of my life. Um, the part of it was that the entire country, meaning Korea, South Korea, was focused on this match. You would walk out into the streets, and people would be, gathered, outside the Four Seasons Hotel, watching these sort of giant television screens uh, showing the match. It was on the front page of every paper every day. And as the match would sway back and forth, towards AlphaGo or back towards Sedol, you could kind of feel the whole country sway in the same way. When certainly when Sedol lost the second match, you could feel this collective sadness across the country. Right, he was a national hero, and and it wasn't just about him losing, but I think we all sort of feel this pang when that sort of thing happens. You relate to him because he's human, right? And when he is beat by this machine, we all feel that sort of sadness. That was real and it was palpable. And then at the same time, when he came back and won Game 4, that sort of elation we all could relate to, and that was an elation that really reverberated across the whole country. Being there was an amazing thing, and it was something that maybe people back in the UK or back in the US didn't feel as much. Right, Go is a national game in places like Korea and China and Japan in a way it isn't in the UK or in the US. So you really felt an importance being there in the country as that was playing out.
As you say, it was one of the most kind of interesting, exciting weeks of your life. Did that take you by surprise a lot, or did you go there thinking something very interesting is going to happen here?
Well, I did make an effort to go. Right, I knew that something was going to happen. It was going to make a good story. I remember pitching to my editor the story, and him saying, "Well, most people assume that that Sedol is going to win, right?" And I said, "Yes, but I think what you're going to see is that the machine is going to win this match. I think what people, Go experts are not taking into account is that this system that DeepMind is building has continued to be improved over the months since it last played a match. Right, it had beaten the European Go champion behind closed doors previously, and from those matches, you could sort of ascertain the level that this system had achieved. What people were not taking into account is that part of the system literally learns from repeated playing, and that sort of learning aspect of the system was what a lot of the experts were not acknowledging as they tried to predict what would happen in Korea. I was confident that the machine was going to win, I didn't know it was going to win, but that's what I was expecting. And it played out in ways certainly that I didn't expect. Like I didn't expect the machine to be that dominant, I didn't expect that twist at the end when Lee Sedol took Game 4. I remember after Game 3 when effectively the machine had won the match. Right, it won three out of 5 games, and my wife said, "Well, are you coming home now?" And I said, "No, I'm going to stay and see how this plays out." And luckily I did stay because that was one of the most interesting moments when Lee Sedol came back and won the 4th game.
Yeah, there is a lovely moment in the documentary where I think you say you're nearly about to tear up, recalling the moment where Lee comes back and wins. As you said, there was a shared interest at one point. For him, I guess you wanted him to at least get one match, even if because that made all the difference. For making him feel a bit better and stuff. I think he said just winning one match was enough or something. It kind of consoled him a bit.
Oh, absolutely right. This isn't. This is about more than just the statistics of that match, right? It's about something more human than that, more important than that, and it's about this larger arc of AI machines and its relationship to us humans.
Are there any kind of interesting behind the scenes stories or insights, conversations you had with either Go experts or, people at DeepMind?
Yeah, a lot of this is in the piece I eventually published at Wired and in a book, I later wrote about the history of neural networks, which is a key technology that's used in AlphaGo. But, the most amazing moment and the most amazing character, as far as I was concerned, who was involved in that match was a guy named Fan Wei. And he was the European Go champion who had lost the match to AlphaGo behind closed doors. And, he's not a native English speaker, but, I ran into him or talked to him in the wake of AlphaGo AlphaGo winning Game 2, right, which was sort of the real sort of devastating moment for a lot of people, and he had this wonderfully poetic way of describing the system and the way it played and the beauty of this system, which had made this sort of this transcendent move to effectively win that match. A move that David Silver, one of the DeepMind engineers, later told me was a move that a human most likely would never have made, right? According to this machine's calculations, which are based on real games involving human players. Its calculation was that a human the chances of a human making that move, an expert player, were 1 in 10,000. But based on the machines, the machine had, based on the games, the machine had effectively played with itself. it decided to make that move anyway. And the way that Fonway described that move in the moment was remarkable. He's a neat guy who shows up in that documentary you talked about as well, and is one of the important characters in that piece. It's a great movie. I was surprised at how effective that documentary was.
Yeah, it really is a beautiful piece. What was it like for watching the documentary back, seeing yourself in it, seeing the images for when you were there?
Well, I thought it did a great job of capturing what it was like to be there. Um, you know, from the small moments with people like Fonway to the larger scope of things, and how this whole country reacted to the event. It really captured what it was like to be there.
Did much change in your perspective of AI technology and the future from being that event? I mean, you said that you predicted that the machine would most likely win. So after it had finished, did you think much differently about the future of AI, or had you kind of expected that to happen? And it was obviously an amazing experience, but nothing had changed much in your mind.
Well, I mean, I think it was an important moment because a game like that is something we can all understand, right? We grow up playing games, and when you have a moment like that, when a machine can beat one of the world's top players at a game like that, it's a way that everyone can understand how the technology is progressing, and because of that phenomenon, that aspect of the system that learns from repeated play, you can see this technology continuing to advance. Like I said, it's based on a technology called a neural network, which is a mathematical system that literally learns tasks by analyzing data. So that might be analyzing Go moves from expert players, or it might be, images or sounds, right? A neural network is what allows Siri to understand the words that we say. It analyzes thousands of hours of spoken words, and it learns to recognize the words that we speak. You can feed a neural network thousands of cat photos, and it can learn to identify the patterns um, that allow it to identify a cat. And you could see a path where this technology could continue to improve um, certain computer skills, right? So image recognition, speech recognition, translation. That was the next area where this technology really improved things, and we continue to see this basic technology improve what scientists call natural language understanding, right? The ability to understand the languages that you and I and others on Earth speak, um, and responding to that. So you're seeing systems now that use the same fundamental technology to apply, um, uh, you know, apply that phenomenon to all sorts of other natural language skills, whether it's question and answer or dialogue, right? Um, we're seeing increasingly, systems that can, you know, move towards carrying on a conversation. We're not there yet, but at the time, you could see the progress in these areas continuing. And it's something as I moved to the Times that I pitched to my editors, right? That this idea would continue to show progress in the years to come.
Since that AlphaGo challenge match, we've had some interesting things happen with all the technologies you've just discussed. We had DeepMind with AlphaFold and OpenAI, with a few things, GPT-3 and DALL-E 2. Can you envision and picture what you think maybe the next moment that's as exciting as for example the AlphaGo match? Is there anything that you think may kind of stand out as a next big milestone that you're excited to see?
Well, I think at this point we need to look beyond the games and look beyond the interesting demos towards where this might really change things in real ways. AlphaFold is a good example, right? That technology, again based on a neural network, can fundamentally change biological research. It may help scientists, for instance, when it comes to drug discovery, right? Developing new vaccines and medicines. And when you think about what OpenAI has done with what they call large language models, so neural networks that can understand language in the way that I described earlier, we need to really think about where that can be of use. And we're starting to see it be of use in certain ways, like that sort of technology has now been deployed with software developers, right? It can in a way generate pieces of software code that developers can then make use of, right? It's not perfect, right? It can't generate software code to the point where it can replace all coders, but it can help software developers do their job, generate snippets of code that they can then use and shape and insert into their projects, and that's where it's starting to be useful. The next area on the horizon are what researchers call multimodal systems. So it's basically the same sort of model, these sort of large language models also applied to images. So you have this system produced by OpenAI, for instance, called DALL-E. And what you can do is you can ask it to give you a photograph, an image. You can describe the image you want. You can say, I want an image of two cats playing chess. And it will generate that image with photorealistic quality. It's a remarkable system in a lot of ways, surprising, entertaining. So then the question becomes, well, how is this going to impact our world in real ways? And that is sort of an open question. But much as these large language models can help developers build software code, something like DALL-E can help graphic designers as they're building images, right? You can have the system generate an image that you can then tweak and modify and insert into the work you're doing. That's not the sort of super intelligent system that a lot of AI researchers have long dreamed of and long claimed was on the horizon. These are systems that are best used in tandem with humans. But that's the sort of thing that I've been looking at and thinking about.
That's interesting. So it'd be good to move on now to talk about the books that you released in the last year, which I've read and is really brilliant, really interesting, titled Genius Makers, the Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook and the World. So first of all, why did you decide to write this book on this topic?
Well, I decided to write it after coming back from Korea in that Go match. That event where you could see how the technology was affecting people in real time, and you could see the interesting characters behind the technology. Demis Hassabis, the CEO and founder of DeepMind, being one prime example. That's when I resolved to write the book. But as I started to pull together a pitch to make to publishers, I became even more interested with a guy named Jeff Hinton, who had worked on that idea, the idea of a neural network, since the early 70s. He embraced this idea at a moment when most people thought it would never work. And as I talked to him more and got to know him, the book and its focus shifted a lot. He became the central character, like the one human thread through the history of this idea, the idea of a neural network, and that that really became the heart of the book. Right? Any good book, any good story is about people, and he became the central person in this book.
I'm just a bit intrigued about the process of writing that book. So, how much of the stories in the book were kind of did you experience firsthand? Were you, did you speak much to these main characters in the book and about these stories and catch it from them, or was it stuff you'd found from research? How did you go about finding out all the content in the book?
It's based on dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews. Almost everyone who is mentioned in the book, I spoke to. There are a few exceptions, but I spoke to almost everyone, and a lot of those stories were revealed for the first time, in the book, or through my own reporting. A couple of the big moments, I had written about before, whether it's the Go match or a couple of other events. But most of that is original research. I do go back in time, right? This is an old idea, the idea of a neural network. It was first proposed in the 50s. And so there's some historical research there. Right? Another interesting character is a guy named Frank Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist in the 1950s and someone who really championed this idea then. He died in the early 70s. So there's some historical research involved, but a lot of that also is firsthand, right? Through people like Jeff Hinton, who have worked in this area since the 70s. People like Jan LeCun, who is now the head of research at Meta, formerly Facebook, and other people who have long worked on this idea.
You must have learned a huge amount about AI whilst writing the book. Were there many big questions or ideas that you've noticed you've changed your mind on that you wouldn't have thought previously before you wrote the book and learned what you did?
Well, I think one thing that has been interesting and I continue to think about is, and I don't think this is widely understood among the general public, AI is an aspirational field, right? In the 1950s, when that term was coined, artificial intelligence, it was coined by this guy named John McCarthy, who was a Dartmouth College professor. He pulled together this summer conference at Dartmouth in 1956, and brought together like-minded people who were interested in this new field. He decided to call it artificial intelligence, and these academics were sure that it wouldn't take long for them to create machines that could do what the human brain could do. Some predicted that within 10 years you would have a system that could beat the world's best players at chess, or that could develop its own mathematical theorem. Well, that didn't happen. The chess piece, didn't happen until 1997, as we discussed. Artificial intelligence from the beginning, it was a misnomer, right? They were building technology that was nowhere close to intelligent, but they were sure that they could do this. And that's a theme throughout the history of AI, and that you continue to see, right? It's very much an aspirational field. And I think that that's something that people outside of the field don't quite understand.
Is that the kind of main reason you're so interested in AI, that it's just this really aspirational field that trying to solve such difficult issues? Is that the reason you're particularly interested in it, as opposed to all the other areas of technology?
I think that that's part of it, but part of what I want to do with the book or with my reporting at the Times is give people a realistic view of this, right? Because it's so aspirational. People often people in the field often talk about the technology in ways that exaggerate its powers. And I think part of my role is to give people a real view of what's going on here and show them exactly what the technology can do and what it can't, and explain this aspirational nature and help them understand that what some people are saying isn't necessarily true.
One thing I've seen you say is that a lot of the visionaries in the field, they continued, going with this when everyone else didn't believe in them. They believed in AI. Everyone thought they were crazy, but they continued. You've spoke to some of these people, maybe all these people that I'm thinking of. What do you think it is about them that you think enabled them to have this belief and to pursue it in the face of doubt?
I admire that quality in anyone, right? Um, Having a firm belief in what you're doing and sticking with it, even in the face of doubts from others, right? That's an admirable quality, and it's a quality that's at the heart of so many great stories. Um, and it's a quality you see, in Jeff Hinton in particular. Um, he believes very strongly what he believes, and he's willing to pursue that. At the same time, he, unlike maybe some others, is he's grounded in a way, and he sees the limits of the current technology, and he's willing to talk about the limits. But he is also very very firm in his beliefs, and he's willing to talk about that. It's an admirable quality, and it's absolutely something that attracted me as I was putting this book together.
So just moving on to some final questions, I kind of want to return to your career a bit more broadly, a bit more general. I mean, you've been a tech journalist for a number of years. What do you enjoy about the work that you do?
Really, it's about talking to people, right? That's the most interesting thing, and um, that's really how the job works. You talk to one person, and you get to the end of a good conversation, and you say, "Who else should I talk to?" Right? And they recommend a few people. You talk to them, um, and the cycle continues. Um, that's really what's most interesting is talking to and getting to know and getting to understand new people, and then helping others do the same. Right? Taking what you have learned, um, taking these conversations you've had, and turning them into a story or a book that others can appreciate.
It feels like with all the technology work and reporting that you do, there are always technology stories that are kind of deeply intertwined with people, as opposed to just technology on its own. I guess that's the thing that you find most interesting.
Well, absolutely. I think that the technology itself is certainly interesting, but it's even more interesting when you think about how this affects us all. And so again, I think that not all technology writing does this, but it should, right? It should look at the intersection of technology and people and society. That is where the technology becomes most important.
Are there any aspects of being a journalist that stand out as being particularly difficult or the most challenging part of the job?
Well, I mean, that piece. I mean, these are complicated issues, complicated in a lot of ways, right? Technically complicated. The ramifications of the technology are complicated, and you have to take in all that complication and then find a way to distill it um, into something that anyone and everyone can understand. That's always hard, and you have to continue to struggle to do that, because again, ultimately it's about imparting this knowledge to anyone. So it's a hard thing to do, to distill that down into its essence, into something that anyone can grasp and enjoy. But that's the job.
I think you certainly did that in the book, though, that's for sure. And I've seen you make the point a few times as well that one thing you really try and do is remain objective in your reporting, and not to take sides and give your opinion too much. Is that difficult, or is this the kind of way you enjoy working? Do you ever wish you could give a bit more of your opinion and your take on things? Or
I mean, it's the way that my mind works, and it's the way I really want to approach things. It's one of the reasons I'm at the Times, because the way I work aligns with the organization, um, and I think that's really what's most effective, and I think that's one of the reasons the book is effective, because it doesn't take any one side. It looks at the entire landscape, and tries to get everyone all the information that they need to understand what is truly going on, and they can make their own decisions.
After spending so many years reporting and thinking and writing about technology, how do you feel about the future and where we're headed?
Well, there are some dark parts to our future. I'll tell you that, and a lot of them relate to AI. We haven't talked much about this, but these systems, these large language models, or these multimodal systems we talked about, right? They're essentially generating fake content, right? They're generating their own images. They're generating text. They're generating tweets, blog posts. We're going to reach a point where it's going to be hard to tell whether text or images or sounds were created by a human or they were created by a machine. We are going to have a skepticism about everything that we see and hear online. And I wonder if we're, as humans, capable of that sort of skepticism. I think it's going to be a real shift.
Do you have any plans for the future with your work? Anything exciting coming up?
Well, I'm going to continue to cover this area at the Times, and all sorts of areas. I'm what they call the emerging technologies reporter. So any technology that is beginning to come to the fore, is it's a potential subject for my stories, and maybe another book at some point. Nothing imminent yet, but I'd like to do another. I would hate to stop at one.
Any thoughts on what the second book may be about?
Not sure yet, but it might be nice to get outside the AI field and do something entirely different.
That's great. We'll look forward to it. Cade, thanks so much for speaking. It was great to hear a bit about your story, but also talk about some AI and tech stuff. Appreciate your time.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoyed the Human Podcast, please consider subscribing. I hope to see you soon.